let's talk about what this does to a person. So we're going to transition to some of the topics about internalized heterosexism, homophobia, and shame. And there's an author, Alan Downs, Dr. Downs. He's written a book called The Velvet Rage. You can find this actually in the reference list attached to the PowerPoint here. And what it talks about is the internalization of shame through one's identity development and how that impacts gay men. So I'm just going to go through some things really quickly here. The book's a great book, and I encourage you to read it if you're going to work with gay men. So gay men can internalize a sense of being different, and different means bad. We as a species tend to have a bit of xenophobia. If it's not what I know, I don't like it. So when you're a young child, before you even have a sense of I might be gay, there's a sense of I might be different. And if that difference isn't associated with positive things, if it's associated with things like I don't fit the mold that my parents have created for me or my friends have created for me, then something is wrong with me. And that's where it can begin. That moves into some negative mirroring from significant others and powerful social messages that get incorporated and internalized into the person. And this leads to that internalizing of the shame, which then later builds things like that internalized homophobia, those heterosexist perspectives, thinking that there's something superior and something inferior, and that inferiority has to do with being gay. Now, a person, once again, who could be filled with gay pride may still have some of these elements, and maybe it's not being put on self anymore, it may be put out on others. One of the ways that that occurs is that gay men tend to compensate, according to Downs, using things like status, wealth, beauty, and power to unconsciously overcome self-loathing. Also, it can be projected as shame and loathing onto others, including other gay men. It's a sense of, I'm me, that's good, anything that's different from me is bad. You see how that's just turning it around and putting it out there so that it's not experienced here. So that takes us to some gender issues facing gay men currently, because certainly gender expression is one of the areas where that shame can really manifest and take hold. So first of all, we know that genderism occurs in the dominant culture, that if you're a boy, you're supposed to act like a boy. If you're a woman, you're supposed to act like a woman. There are certainly areas where we have fluidity regionally, and there are certain areas regionally where there's some very strict rules about gender. We know that there's, for men, a push towards traditional masculinity. And if you aren't the traditional guy, that's met with sanctions for violations, and that can range from being ostracized to being beaten up or bullied. Gay males often violate these gender roles that are set forth by the dominant culture because of this sense of freedom in being able to express variation along the gender continuum. So we have a sense of fluidity in the gay male community, which can often be met by the dominant culture with disdain. So there's a bit of risk in finding what your true gender expression, or even playing around with gender identity expression. And so as far as gender issues facing men, this can actually lead to some of that discrimination, prejudice, and violence. But I can tell you on the other positive element of this, there's a sense of freedom from repression when one can really identify what your gender identity is and be able to live that and express that. Oftentimes this fluidity is a result of the sense of I want to have the freedom from the repression that I've experienced in the past. So real quick, I'm going to do a very brief, we're going to do a little history again, so bear with me. And this is sort of a history of, in the last century, of gay male gender roles. Prior to the 1960s, gay men lived a dichotomous life. Remember that picture where you saw the fragmenting, where there was part masculine, part feminine? It's a good representation of what it looked like prior to 1960s and above. Gay men often would go out to their workplaces, to their families, and be very masculine, and then go to the underground bars, the hidden spaces, and express a lot of femininity. That was the place to kind of release the repression. What happened, though, after the 60s, when we began to move into more of the liberationist front, is that we began to have an expression from the 60s to the 70s, during the time of free love and free expression. There's a term called the clones, and actually an author, Levine, talked about this. And the clones were basically this hyper-masculine, at least outward expression of masculinity. These sort of hegemonic notions of what it means to be male, and sexual conquest became part of those. You'll see a picture there. That's a picture of the Village People. If you don't know who the Village People are, they were an entertainment act around that time. And really what they represent are all these masculine presentations, these personas of masculinity that were being put out from the gay community around that time. But if you really look at the picture, you also see there's a bit of femininity in there as well. And if you know anything about the Village People, there were certainly feminine expressions. So what was being presented as masculine was really, in some ways, an integration of both of those elements. So if we think about the 80s to the present, there's certainly a space right now for both the hegemonic masculinity. Remember that picture I showed you that I said were about the bears. And so there's that sense of being very masculine and what's masculinity about, kind of falling into some of the masculine stereotypes. And there's certainly expression of femininity that we can still see amongst the drag queens and amongst other parts of the gay male culture. It is important to note, as you work with gay men, there may be some negative energy about meeting certain body image ideals, certain ways of expressing one's gender, and each subgroup may have rules and sanctions and values about what you can do. This is almost, once again, a sort of recreation of those same dynamics that we were talking about earlier from the dominant culture. We also can see sexism between gay men and lesbians, meaning to be male is ideal and superior to being a woman, which still is sort of that sexism. It's the same message of being inferior. Now, having said that, I don't want to paint a picture that there's all of this disjointed disconnection in the community. It's certainly present there. There's also this huge impact of togetherness that can happen in the community that we're going to talk about.